quietly. That is how he loved me. No announcements, no introductions, no photographs, just private dinners, careful whispers, and a relationship that lived entirely in the dark. For 2 years I told myself that quiet love was still love. Then, one Tuesday morning I walked into his office, and a woman I had never seen before looked at me like she had been waiting to. Stay with me, because what happens in that office in the next few minutes is going to change everything you think you know about this story. Sung-ho Lim was not the kind of man you noticed immediately. He was the kind of man you noticed correctly, after you had been in a room with him long enough to realize that the most deliberate person present had not yet raised his voice and did not need to. He was the senior partner at Lim & Associates, one of Seoul's most respected architectural firms, and his name sat on the 14th floor directory in clean, unassuming type that somehow managed to carry the weight of everything the firm had built across 3 decades. He was 38 years old. He was the youngest senior partner in the firm's history, and his family had helped design enough of Seoul's skyline that looking out of his office window was, in some quiet way, like reading his last name written across the horizon. He was brilliant in the specific way that disciplined people are brilliant, not loudly, not with performance, but with a consistency that made the people around him work harder simply because his standard was visible and it was high. He chose his words the way he chose building materials, carefully, deliberately, with a precise understanding of what would hold under pressure and what would eventually give. He was also, when he wanted to be, the most present person in a room of one. Nadia met him at a city planning conference 3 years ago. She was there as a consultant for a cultural center development project. He was presenting a paper on adaptive reuse in urban heritage districts, which sounds like exactly the kind of topic that empties a room after the first 10 minutes, except that when Sung-ho Lim presented, people leaned forward in their chairs without realizing they were doing it. She was in the 4th row. She was taking notes, not because she needed to, but because the ideas were good enough to deserve the courtesy. During the Q&A, while 3 other attendees asked variations of the same question dressed up in different vocabulary, Sung-ho looked out across the room and asked Nadia something no one else had thought to ask, a question about the human cost of preservation, about what it meant to maintain the architecture of a community when the community itself had already moved on. It was a real question, not rhetorical, not performative. She answered it, directly, without softening it into something easier. He found her afterward in the hallway with 2 cups of coffee, one of which he handed her without asking how she took it, having apparently decided that the kind of person who gave that answer was the kind of person who took their coffee without ceremony. He said, "You were the most interesting person in that room, and I don't think anyone else noticed." She noticed him noticing. That was the beginning. What followed was a relationship that existed in full color inside 4 walls and disappeared completely the moment those walls opened to the outside world. They cooked in her apartment on weekend mornings, unhurried and easy in the way of 2 people who do not need to perform for each other. They walked through neighborhoods he was in the early stages of redesigning, and he would tell her what he saw in a building that looked like nothing, the original intention of it, the decisions that had been made and unmade in its bones. And she would listen and then say something that reframed the whole thing, and he would go quiet for a moment in that way he had that meant he was genuinely thinking rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. Their conversations went past midnight regularly, and he would leave her apartment at an hour that was unreasonable for a man who was at his desk by 7, and he never seemed to calculate the cost of that. It felt, from the inside, like being chosen, like being worth the inconvenience of the drive home in the dark. But he never introduced her to a colleague, never brought her to an event, never mentioned her name in a room that contained more than the 2 of them. Every time she moved gently toward the question of visibility, not demanding, not ultimatum issuing, just honestly and quietly asking where this was going. He had an answer that sounded like a timeline but functioned as a delay. His family had expectations that were complicated to navigate. A major project was in a critical phase. Once things settled, once the timing aligned, he would make it right. She believed him, not blindly, not without the small, persistent awareness in the back of her mind that the timeline kept extending. She believed him because the man she experienced in private felt entirely genuine, and she made the conscious choice to extend trust to someone whose private self had not yet given her a reason to withdraw it. Nadia was not a woman who confused patience with passivity. She was a consultant whose career was built on the ability to read situations accurately and respond with precision. She had walked away from things that weren't working her entire adult life without ceremony or second-guessing. She chose to stay in this because it felt, underneath all the quiet, like something worth staying for. That distinction mattered. She was not naive. She was trusting. Those are different things, and the story will not let you forget it. On a Tuesday morning in the middle of an ordinary week, Sung-ho called her. His voice was professional, slightly apologetic, the tone he used when he was asking something that required her to rearrange her schedule. There was a contract dispute on a mixed-use development project she had consulted on 8 months ago. A clause in her original agreement needed clarification, and her signature was required for the firm's legal team to proceed. Administrative, he said. Inconvenient, but straightforward. 20 minutes, he said. She said, of course. She wrote down the address as though she had not already known it for 2 years. After she hung up, she sat at her desk for a moment without moving. This was the first time in 2 years he had asked her to come to the office. She told herself it meant nothing. Administrative visit, legal paperwork. Up to 20 minutes. Then she stood up and went to her wardrobe and chose her camel coat, the structured one, the one he had seen her in exactly once 2 winters ago when they passed each other briefly in public, and he looked at her the way he rarely allowed himself to look at her outside of private spaces, and said quietly that she looked like someone worth stopping on the street for. She chose it. Then she told herself she was being practical because it was a cool morning. She was not being practical. She arrived at Lim & Associates at 10:40 on a Tuesday morning, and the building was exactly as she had always imagined it, restrained, precise, the kind of structure that does not announce itself but expects to be taken seriously. When she signed in at reception, and the woman at the desk smiled and said 14th floor with the easy familiarity of someone who had already been told her name. That detail settled somewhere in Nadia's awareness, but she did not examine it yet. She was still managing the larger sensation, the low, careful thrum of hope she was carrying into this building, like something fragile she did not want to admit she was holding. She rode the elevator alone. The city opened up beyond the glass beside her. The sweep of it, the density, the skyline that carried his family's name in steel and stone. She thought about the version of this moment she had imagined occasionally over the past 2 years. Walking into his world, being known in it. The 20-minute administrative visit that might quietly be the beginning of something else. No, she thought, maybe this is finally it. Maybe this is the beginning of Visible. The elevator opened. She walked toward the glass doors of the executive suite. They parted, and the first thing Nadia saw was a woman standing at Sung-ho's desk. She was polished in the way that comes from a life that was always designed to look a certain way, not effortful, not constructed in the morning, but settled, like someone who had never needed to decide what version of herself to present, because there had only ever been one version. Her hand rested on a stack of project files. She was mid-sentence when the doors opened, her voice low and professional, entirely at home in a room that Nadia had never once been permitted to enter. She stopped speaking. She turned. She looked at Nadia, not quickly, not dismissively, but slowly, and with complete attention, in the manner of someone whose mind was moving very fast underneath a surface that was, for exactly 3 more seconds, still. Then something shifted. The composure did not break cleanly. It cracked from the inside, the way a surface does when the pressure has been building beneath it long enough that the crack, when it comes, looks almost inevitable. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes went hot with something that was not simply surprise. This was recognition. The specific, involuntary recognition of a woman who had been hearing a name in the background of her life for long enough that finally seeing the face attached to it was not a shock, but a confirmation, and the confirmation was worse. She pointed, not gently, not as punctuation, as a statement, and she said, "So, this is her." The office went still in the way offices go still when something real is happening in a space designed for the performance of professional composure. Two colleagues developed a sudden and complete absorption in whatever was on their respective screens. A phone rang once and was not answered. Nadia did not flinch. She had spent 2 years developing the ability to remain steady in moments that made steadiness difficult. It was perhaps the most quietly costly thing the relationship had asked of her, and she had not known until this moment that she had been in training for exactly this. She did not look at Sung-ho. Not yet. She looked directly at Jisoo, and she said, in a voice that was entirely level, "And you are." Not because she did not already sense the weight of the answer, but because she needed to hear Sung-ho provide it, out loud, in this room. In front of the people who worked for him and the woman who was currently radiating enough emotional heat to warm the entire floor. Sung-ho said, "Jisoo is my co-director." Nadia waited. Because co-director was a title. It was an organizational chart entry. It was not an explanation for what was currently written across this woman's face and the room and the particular quality of the silence that had followed the words. So this is her, with the weight of someone who had been waiting to say them. Sung-ho added nothing, and that addition of nothing, that careful architectural silence, was more informative than anything he could have said. Jisoo Han had known Sung-ho Lim since they were graduate students, in the same program at a university where both of their families had endowed buildings, which tells you something about the world they came from and the particular shorthand that world provided for relationships that never needed to be defined out loud, because the definition was ambient, structural, built into the environment the way load-bearing walls are built into a floor plan. Their families moved in the same circles, attended the same events, referenced each other in conversations with the easy frequency of people who assume continuity. There had been, for as long as either of them could remember, a quiet collective understanding among everyone who knew them both, not an arrangement, nothing so formal, simply an assumption, be held with the confidence of people who had never needed to question it, that Jisoo and Sung-ho would eventually formalize what everyone already treated as settled. Jisoo had known about Nadia. That is the part that requires sitting with. She had known in the way you know about a weather system that is developing offshore, tracking it, monitoring the distance, making assessments about whether it would make landfall or dissipate before it reached you. Sung-ho had given her the version he calculated she could accept. Something early in development, something complicated in its origins, something that was already, by his telling, resolving itself by the natural weight of circumstance. She chose to accept that version. She made the choice consciously. Because the alternative, sitting with the possibility that Sung-ho was not resolving anything, but was instead sustaining two separate understandings simultaneously and simply waiting for one of them to stop requiring attention, was a conclusion that demanded a conversation she was not certain she wanted to have, because having it would require him to say something definitive. And what if the definitive thing was not the thing she needed to hear? So she believed the version he offered. She remained present. She continued to build, professionally and personally, in the space that their shared history occupied. She told herself she was being mature about a complicated situation. She told herself she trusted him. Nadia had not resolved. Nadia was standing in front of her in a camel coat that fit like it had been chosen deliberately, looking entirely, genuinely unaware that she had been cast as a chapter that had already closed. Jisoo's anger was not a performance. It was not strategic. It was the sound that 2 years of composed patience makes when it finally runs out of room. She turned to Sung-ho. Her voice was controlled, but only in the way a current is controlled by the banks of a river. The force was entirely present, only the direction was managed. "You told me it was over." 3 keyboards stopped. Sung-ho said her name, Jisoo. The way you say a name when you're trying to change the temperature of a room with a single word. "You told me," she said again, quieter, not softer. Quieter, which was worse because it meant the feeling was no longer trying to get out. It had gotten out. It was simply standing there now, occupying the room with the patient, immovable quality of something that had stopped asking for permission. Nadia stood completely still. She was processing 2 things at the same time. The anger of the woman across the desk from her, which was real and present and aimed with a precision that had nothing to do with performance, and the arithmetic. The specific clarifying arithmetic of what that anger was confirming about the last 2 years of her life. She began to do what she always did when a situation required understanding rather than reaction. She began to think it through. She thought about every professional event she had not been invited to, every colleague whose name she knew only because Sung-ho had mentioned it in passing, attached to a pronoun but never a face. Every time she had asked gently what they were, what this was, and received an answer that was warm and genuine, and somehow managed to contain no actual information about the future. She thought about the receptionist downstairs who had smiled and said 14th floor with the easy familiarity of someone who had been given a name in advance. She thought about the way Jisoo had said so. This is her, not who is this, not can I help you, but so this is her, with the inflection of a woman completing a sentence she had already started in her own mind some time ago. Nadia had not been kept invisible because the world wasn't ready. She had not been kept invisible because of cultural complexity or family expectation or the particular demands of a critical project phase. She had been kept invisible because Sung-ho needed her invisible. Because visibility would have required a conversation that visibility made unavoidable. Because as long as Nadia existed only in the private spaces he controlled, he could continue to manage 2 separate realities without either one demanding that he choose. The realization did not arrive as a sudden rupture. It arrived the way a building settles, in small incremental shifts, each one negligible on its own, adding up across time to something that changes the fundamental integrity of the structure. She thought, 2 years. 2 years she had been patient with a timeline that was never a timeline. 2 years she had accepted delays as context rather than reading them as decisions. 2 years she had trusted the private version of him and told herself the public version would follow. It was not going to follow. It was never going to follow. And somewhere in the room, a woman who had been waiting for her own version of the same thing was pointing at her and confirming it with more honesty than Sung-ho had managed in 24 months. Jisoo said something then that she had not planned to say. It came out in the middle of a sentence that started as directed anger and shifted mid-course into something unguarded. A reference to a specific evening, a dinner, a conversation, something Sung-ho had said to her in a moment that had clearly been private and clearly been significant, and clearly been the kind of thing a person holds carefully because it felt like a promise without being stated as one. She caught herself the moment it left her mouth. The composure reassembled quickly, efficiently. Jisoo was practiced at composure. It was one of the primary tools of her environment, but it was too late. The sentence was already in the room. And it had arrived not as a weapon, not as a territorial marker, but as the accidental evidence of a woman who was not simply angry, she was heartbroken. Nadia heard it, heard the specific quality of it, the way genuine feeling sounds different from performed feeling, the way grief has a register that cannot be manufactured. And she felt something she had not expected to feel in this office, standing across from this woman who had pointed at her and named her like an accusation. Recognition. Not sympathy exactly. Not alliance. They were nowhere near that. But the kind of recognition that arrives when you see yourself in a situation you did not expect to see yourself in. The particular, mate and comfortable clarity of a woman who understood precisely what it looked like to love someone more than he had earned. She'd been wearing that expression herself for 2 years. She knew every line of it. Jisoo composed herself. The armor went back into place with the practiced speed of someone who had been putting it back on their whole life. But the moment had happened, and Nadia had seen behind it, and what she saw there did not make Jisoo her enemy. It made her a mirror. Sung-ho spoke. He addressed Nadia first. The voice he used was measured and careful, the same register he used when he was managing a situation rather than inhabiting it. And she recognized it now with a clarity that was new and that she understood she would not be able to unrecognize. He said the right words. He said, "Let me explain." He said, "I know how this looks." He said, "It's more complicated than what you're seeing right now." And she noticed, with the precise attention of someone who had been consulting her way through complex situations for a decade, that he said, "Let me explain," before he said, "I'm sorry." That ordering was not accidental. It was the instinct of a man who believed that sufficient explanation could substitute for accountability. He turned to Jisoo. The register changed, not dramatically. He was too controlled for drama, but perceptibly. His voice dropped slightly, took on the weight of longer history. He said her name the way you say the name of someone you have known long enough that the name itself is a kind of shorthand for an entire accumulated understanding. Ma and that shift in how he held each of them in his voice, told Nadia more than the content of any sentence he had produced. She was not watching a man confess, she was watching a man negotiate, even now, standing in the center of everything his silence had built, with two women on either side of a desk that had never been available to either of them in the way they deserved. He was still doing what he had always done. He was still looking for the version of events that kept the most things intact. He was still designing his way through a situation that had stopped being designable the moment Jisoo said so, "This is her," and the room stopped pretending. Nadia looked at him for a long moment. She picked up the signed contract from his desk. She did not make a gesture of it, did not leave it as a statement. She simply picked up her copy, because it was hers, because she had come here for it, because taking the thing that was hers and leaving was precisely the right and only movement available to her in this moment. She straightened her coat. She looked at Sung-ho with the specific quiet devastation of someone who has just finished understanding something they have been half understanding for a very long time. She said, "I'll let you get back to your meeting." That was all. She walked to the glass doors. She did not look back, not at Sung-ho, not at Jisoo, not at the colleagues who had stopped pretending to type. She walked through the doors, and they closed behind her with the quiet, unremarkable sound of an ordinary Tuesday morning, which was somehow the most precise sound the moment could have made. The silence that remained in the executive suite after the doors closed was a different quality of silence than the one that had preceded them opening. Jisoo did not move immediately. She stood where she had been standing, and she watched the glass doors with an expression that had shifted entirely from what it had been 60 seconds ago. The heat was still present, but it had changed character. It was no longer aimed outward. It had turned inward and was asking something. She had expected, she realized, for this moment to feel like resolution. She had been carrying the weight of Nadia's existence in the background of her life for months, and she had told herself, without fully admitting she was telling herself, that seeing her, naming her, forcing the situation into the open would release something, would make the path forward clearer. Instead, she was standing in an office full of people, pretending not to have witnessed what they had all just witnessed, and the woman she had pointed at had walked out of the room with more composure than Jisoo herself was currently managing. No raised voice, no tears, no demand for an explanation that would make any of this hurt less. Just, "I'll let you get back to your meeting," and the door closing and the city continuing outside, as though nothing of consequence had occurred. Jisoo turned to Sung-ho. The anger in her face had not gone, but it was quieter now, more considered, the kind of anger that has moved past the initial eruption and arrived at the part where it starts asking better questions. "What exactly have you been waiting for?" Sung-ho did not answer. She waited. She was experienced at waiting. She had been waiting for a version of this conversation for longer than she cared to calculate. "Because she just walked out of here," Jisoo said, like a woman who already knows the answer. The sentence landed in the room and stayed there. Because it was true, and the truth of it was not comfortable for either of them. Jisoo had come into this office that morning carrying the assumption, held with the same quiet confidence she brought to all her long-held assumptions, that whatever Nadia was, she was a complication. Someone temporary. Someone who, when confronted with the full reality of what she was competing with, would show the fragility that Jisoo had, perhaps unkindly, always privately assigned to her in the abstract. Nadia Owens had not shown fragility. She had shown the particular, unshakable dignity of a woman who had already done the work of understanding her own value before she walked into the room. And Jisoo, standing in the office that she shared with a man who had apparently been managing them both with the same careful, unconscious architecture for 2 years, had to sit with the slow and uncomfortable arrival of a question she was not ready to answer. What, exactly, was she fighting for? Nadia walked 2 blocks before she stopped, not because her legs failed her, not because the emotion overtook her. She stopped because 2 blocks felt like a sufficient distance from the building to allow her to be somewhere that was simply hers. Ordinary pavement, ordinary afternoon light, the ordinary sound of soul conducting its Tuesday business around her. She found a bench at the edge of a small plaza. She sat. She put the contract in her bag. She placed her hands in her lap. She looked at a point in the middle distance, and she let herself feel the full weight of what she was carrying without managing it. The grief arrived first, not the anger. The anger would come, and it would be clean and reasonable and would serve her well when it did. But first, the grief. The specific, non-dramatic grief of someone who loved a real thing that turned out to be only partially real. Because the private dinners were real. The late conversations were real. The version of Sung-ho who asked her a question in a conference hall 4 rows back and then found her afterward with coffee he had already assumed she would take. That man was real. His attention was real. The tenderness was real. The particular way he had of making her feel like the most considered person in whatever room they occupied together, that was real. None of it was manufactured. None of it was cynical. She was certain of that, and the certainty made the grief more precise rather than less, because it meant she could not simplify this into a story about a bad man and a deceived woman and a clean moral conclusion. It was more complicated and more human than that. He had loved her, in the space he had built for loving her. He had loved her completely and genuinely and without reservation, inside the box. And he had never built the box a door. She had spent 2 years decorating the inside of it and calling it a home. She sat with that for a while, not to punish herself with it, not to rehearse it into something she would carry forever, but because it deserved to be felt accurately before it was filed away. Because she was a woman who believed in understanding things correctly, and understanding this correctly required not minimizing it. She was not angry at herself for loving him. She did not think she had been foolish. She thought she had been trusting, which was different, and she intended to remain a woman who trusted people because the alternative was a smaller life than she was willing to live. She was simply, finally, completely done. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Sung-ho. She looked at his name for a long time, long enough that the call went to voicemail, long enough to be certain that what she felt in response to seeing it was not the thing she used to feel, not the warmth, not the pull, but something much quieter, something that felt, not if she was honest, like the last of an obligation releasing. There was nothing he could say from that office at this moment that she needed to receive, not because she was punishing him, not as a tactic. She was not a woman who used silence as a weapon. She used it as a boundary, which was entirely different. She had given him 2 years of patience. She had given him the benefit of every doubt she had available. She had waited for a timeline that was never going to arrive because the man controlling it had never actually intended to move it forward. She did not owe him 1 more minute of waiting. She put the phone face down on the bench beside her. She looked at the city. She breathed. 3 weeks passed. Nadia returned to her own work with the focused, grounded energy of someone who has put something down that they had been carrying for too long without acknowledging the weight. She had her own consulting practice. She had clients who valued her, projects that engaged her, a professional reputation she had built entirely independently of anyone else's name or approval. That work had always been there. She had simply been allocating a quiet portion of her attention to the space Sung-ho occupied, and now that space was available for something else. She did not speak about the office visit. She did not process it publicly or privately in ways that extended its claim on her. She understood what had happened, she had felt it accurately, and she was prepared to move forward with the clarity it had provided. On a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after the Tuesday that changed everything, a message arrived in her professional inbox. The sender was Ji-Soo Han. Nadia read the name twice. The message was short, measured, entirely professional in its register, which told her something about the kind of woman Ji-Soo was when she was not standing in an office with her jaw tight and her hand raised. She was writing, she said, regarding a cultural heritage development project she was leading. Independently, Nadia noted, from Lim and Associates. She had encountered Nadia's consulting portfolio through a mutual professional contact. The work was impressive and well-suited to the project's requirements. She would like to discuss the possibility of a collaboration if Nadia had availability. She did not reference the office, did not acknowledge the Tuesday, did not apologize or explain or gesture toward any of the history that sat between them like furniture in a room they had both been in once and hoped never to return to. She simply extended a professional hand from one woman to another. Nadia read the message twice. Then she read it a third time, not because it was unclear, but because she was taking the measure of it, of the woman who had written it, of what it said about Jisoo, that this was the form her reaching out had taken. Not an emotional accounting, not a request for absolution, but work. Real work. The kind of reaching across a difficult space that asks nothing of the past and everything of what is possible going forward. She thought about the moment in the office when Jisoo's composure had cracked and something unguarded had come through. The grief beneath the anger, the tenderness that had no business surviving that situation and had survived it anyway. She thought about the particular quality of loving someone more than he had earned, and how she had recognized it in Jisoo, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of involuntary solidarity that she had not expected and had not asked for. She thought about the woman who had pointed at her and said so. This is her, not with the cold calculation of an adversary, but with the hot, exhausted fury of someone who had been patient for too long and had finally run out of reasons to remain so. She thought, she is not so different from me. And then she thought, she is also very possibly excellent at her work, and this project sounds genuinely interesting. And I'm a professional who makes professional decisions based on the merit of an opportunity rather than the emotional weather surrounding it. She opened a reply. She typed one line. Send me the brief. As for Sung-ho Lim, he did not lose everything. That would be too clean an ending for a man whose mistakes were not dramatic, but structural. And structural problems rarely produce dramatic consequences. They produce slow, incremental misalignments that accumulate across time until the thing that was built without the right foundation simply stops being available for the purpose it was designed for. His firm continued. His career continued. He was, and remained, a talented architect whose work was genuine and whose professional contributions were real and valuable, independent of what he had failed to build in his private life. But he had a conversation with his family, eventually, that he should have had years before. He said the things that needed to be said. He said them too late, and without the courage that would have made them mean something when it mattered, which changed their weight considerably. He reached out to Nadia twice after the Tuesday. She was polite. She was measured. She was entirely unavailable in the way that has nothing to do with geography, the way that means a person has simply moved the thing you were reaching for to somewhere you no longer have access to. He reached out to Jisoo. That conversation lasted a long time. What came of it belonged to the two of them, to what they decided they were and were not to each other, to the honest accounting of what had been assumed and what had been real, and what, if anything, remained when the assumptions were removed. That is their story. This is not that story. Some things resolve into something new. Some things simply stop. Both are, in their own way, a kind of answer. Nadia stood at her desk on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after the Tuesday that had rearranged her understanding of the past 2 years, reading Jisoo's project brief on her screen. It was good work, carefully researched, asking the right questions about preservation and community and the human cost of maintaining the architecture of a place when the place is changing around it. She thought about the conference where she had met Sung-ho, the question he had asked from the front of the room, the way good questions find the people who are ready for them. She pulled up a blank document and began to write her response, not about him, not about any of it, about the work, about what she could see in a project that someone else had designed that was asking exactly the right questions. He loved me quietly for 2 years. I thought that meant he was careful. I understand now that it meant he was afraid. And I spent 2 years being patient with a fear that was never mine to carry. The woman who walked out of that office without looking back, she was always inside me. She simply needed someone to finally make her necessary. She needed one Tuesday morning and a woman pointing across a desk and 4 words that stripped away 2 years of careful, comfortable quiet and replaced it with something that could not be ignored. So this is her. Yes, this is her. This is exactly her. And she is done being anyone's kept thing. Done being loved in private by someone who needed her silent. Done giving her patience to a timeline that was never designed to move. If you are somewhere in a quiet love right now, ask yourself the question she took too long to ask. Is it quiet because it is peaceful? Or is it quiet because someone needs you not to make a sound? You deserve to be someone's out loud. If this story stayed with you, if you felt what Nadia carried and recognized something in how she finally put it down, subscribe and stay close. The next story coming to this channel is going to sit with you even longer. You do not want to miss it.